Welcome, everyone. My name's Lane Sturdivant, pronouns they, them. I live in Midcoast, Maine. And this tonight is one of our discussions of our Let's Talk About Digital Threats to Democracy series that we've been putting on with the League of Women Voters of Maine and League of Women Voters of Alaska. So welcome. Tonight's discussion we call Discriminatory Effects of AI and Algorithms. And we're very happy to have Mona Sloane, who is an assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia. And at UVA, Mona runs the Sloane Lab, which conducts empirical research into the implications of technology for the organization of social life, and focuses on AI as a social phenomenon that intersects with wider cultural, economic, material, and political conditions. So perfect guest for this topic. Thanks so much for coming and chatting with us, Mona. I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you have some slides prepared, and you're going to share some information with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lane, and thank you all for having me. It's a true honor to be in the same space as you and to talk to you about artificial intelligence and democracy and the threats to democracy. Before I start, I want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer in that I have chosen to, quote unquote, go into the weeds a little bit today. That means into detail, and I want to tell you about how recruiters use artificial intelligence systems to find people and how that human-machine interaction clashes sometimes, because at that clash is where intransparency and problems occur. And then I also have a little bit of a slide that explains generative AI, because generative AI is a new quote unquote general purpose technology that shifts the game a little bit, and you'll see what that means. And then I really hope we have enough time to discuss among us. So let me make sure I get this sorted so that you can see my slides and I share the right screen. Learned all of this in Zoom University. Okay, so you should be seeing just the slides. Lane, if you could give me a thumbs up, not the notes.
Once it loads. There we go. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I like to always point out what it means to look at technology and artificial intelligence specifically as a sociologist. So I'm not an engineer, I'm not a data scientist by training, I am a social scientist, and I study people who create these technologies and how these technologies get embedded into social life. And that is really the lens which I use across the board. And so Elaine just said that earlier, I put that in my bio as well. Usually I have a point of departure that is, my understanding is that AI is a technology that expresses and constitutes our social relations, how we interact with each other, how we interact with institutions, whether that is the medical system, whether that is the organizations or institutions that we work in or for, whether that is within the family unit. You can think about emailing. So it's really integral to how we organize ourselves in community. And so it has this sort of very profound function that it has taken on slowly over the years, and that is growing now. I'll explain what that means. And because of that, because it is such a basically a sociological mega phenomenon at this point, and I'm not saying that lightly because I'm quite critical of the AI hype, but we do have to acknowledge what these particular systems are doing to how we relate to one another. Because of that, it of course intersects with social, cultural, economic, material, and political conditions. And so what does that mean? That means, for example, social organization aside, we can think about the production of cultural objects or goods. Right now, we have the strike of the Actors Guild, the Writers Guild, and the Actors Guild as well. And so we have seen a lot of conversation about artificial intelligence used to basically capture images of actors, and actors having to sign away their rights to their likeness, and then these systems reproducing the likeliness in digitally produced films. So that is, a context, a cultural production context. We have an economic context where we talk a lot about automation. We hear that a lot from policymakers and politicians at the moment. What does artificial intelligence mean for the future of work? Will we all be out of jobs? We won't, I can tell you that. But the sort of automation, of course, is the most obvious economic concern that comes to the fore here. Material conditions, very much. Artificial intelligence systems require a lot of energy to run. These large language models that facilitate systems like ChatGPT actually take up enormous amounts of energy to be trained in the first place, and then to continually run because they continually learn. We also have a move, towards e-mobility, so electric vehicles, which is, of course, on the one hand, great for the environment. Those systems are also partially run by AI, the cars, and still lithium batteries, cobalt mining is a huge topic within that. And of course, we have political conditions, we have inequality that is baked into these systems on the one hand. So, for example, we have inequality in accuracy of some of these artificial intelligence systems. If we think about, for example, a well-known case study, which is the use of facial recognition technology, and we have seen through work of leading scholars such as Timnit Gebru, who was fired by Google, or Joy Buolamwini, who wrote a paper that showed that facial recognition systems are very bad in recognizing darker skin tones, and not just that, they are also bad at recognizing female faces. So there is what we call an intersectional inequality here. So two identifiers, female and racial identifier, are intersecting, that are doubling the discriminatory effect of poor accuracy of AI systems. And so facial recognition technology is, for example, used in policing. It is also used or was used in hiring. So when you think about how potentially discriminatory AI systems are used in these high stakes contexts, then of course we can see huge problems potentially on the horizon. And when we sort of take the political conditions literally, then we can also think about targeted advertising that is facilitated through artificial intelligence systems. So the Cambridge Analytica scandal, political advertising, we are, looking at an election next year. And so there are questions around targeting specific populations with specific messages that can potentially be accelerated through artificial intelligence systems. So as you can see, they're sort of everywhere. But when we talk about artificial intelligence, we are actually using an old sort of narrative that has been around for a long time, in the sense that we are thinking about AI as either, the right future in which we won't have to work because the systems are so good in doing everything for us that we can just kick back and relax. And in fact, artificial intelligence narratives about the future have in the past, for example, prompted conversations about universal basic income in anticipation of that future in which we don't have to work, which is quite interesting. So a utopian future on the one hand, and that is always sort of sitting just across the dystopian future, which is the one in which the robots are taking our jobs before they're taking over society entirely, which is why it chose to use the Terminator image here. And so if you think about this, when you read in the press about artificial intelligence, we are sort of still trapped in that binary narrative about utopian future versus dystopian future. And there are, of course, certain interest groups who like to choose one narrative over the other. And so we have, of course, tech companies who like to promote the utopian future. Then we have, sometimes activists who say, well, we're really concerned here, for example, about mass loss of jobs, and that narrative is used to get politicians to care just a little bit, so we can move forward with a little bit of AI regulation. So it's still there, and that has always been around. It is important that the narrative, so looking at how we talk about artificial intelligence, really tells us about what futures are possible or even desirable. So it's almost talking about artificial intelligence at this point in time almost is a gateway into how we envision our future to be in general as societies. Governments like to think about the fourth industrial revolution that is ushered in by artificial intelligence, for example. So it takes on this very prominent place in our collective imagination at the moment. And so people also switch camps sometimes. This is Geoffrey Hinton, who is a very famous and well-known artificial intelligence researcher who just resigned from his role at Google after he became a wealthy man. There, he had sold his company, and he is one person who kind of was quite moderate about the effects of artificial intelligence, who just recently, as generative AI started to enter the scene, has become concerned about the effects of artificial intelligence. But, and this is where it gets interesting, warns us about sentient machines. So machines that are basically terminators, potentially, that can take over. And you can see, again, this old pattern of artificial intelligence narratives. And you can also see how somebody in power can choose camps and deploy these sort of old narratives to whatever end they wish. So when I talk about the use of artificial intelligence in recruiting, and go quote unquote into the weeds a little bit, this is the backdrop. Okay, so always also think about the narratives and think about these bigger political and economic and material and cultural conditions and contexts in which we move. But we have not answered one important question, which is the one, what is artificial intelligence? And I'm sure you've had speakers before who talked about this. I like to show this little comic at this juncture, which neatly points out some positions or a position that some people take, which is the one that artificial intelligence is just statistics. It's just about probability. What is most likely to happen in the future? And that is then used as a basis for essentially making or recommending a decision. This is where, for example, targeted advertising comes in. Right, you are suggesting something to you, or predicting how sick you will be when you are in retirement based on your health records and your genetics, for example, or predicting recidivism in the criminal justice system. So some people say it's just glorified statistics. Other people say, well, that's not quite true, because essentially we are in a new era in which we are, just by way of being in the world, are continually producing data all the time, whether we want it or not, whether we have smart devices or not. We just walking the street, you are most likely to be captured by a camera. So we have this continuous data production on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have really accelerated computational capacity. So we have really advanced computers that allow us to process that data and find patterns in that data. And so some people say, well, this is why AI is not just statistics. This is why we're in sort of a new era. And generative AI, again, we'll talk about that a little later, is something that's sort of underlining that a little bit, right? That we've kind of broken out of the sort of statistics domain. There is outside of generative AI, again, which is its own league, we can very broadly technically distinguish between two types of AI systems. And so that technical distinction is pretty useful. We have rule-based AI systems or learning-based AI systems. Learning-based AI systems are given a set of rules and then are learning how to quote unquote play best according to these rules. So you can think about Deep Blue, which is the rule-based system that beat Garry Kasparov in chess. But you can also think about rules and play in different contexts. You can think about AI-driven trading on the stock market according to rules, right? So that's an applied example of an AI rule-based AI system at play. Now, the second one is the learning-based one, which is the one that we usually mean when we talk about AI in this sort of utopian or dystopian sense. That is, those are systems that are not given instructions, but that are given large amounts of data and then by themselves detect patterns in that data and then again make decisions based on those patterns and then get deployed in the world, and then the interaction with that system is fed back into the system and new data is generated, more intricate patterns emerge. So those are the two important distinctions. And so learning AI is the one that we also mean when we say deep learning. Those are the machine learning systems that are sort of are the more prominent ones. Now, I'm putting my sociology hat back on and just say, okay, so what does this mean for social life? And I really like this definition that I found in a law review article written by a scholar who is a legal scholar and also a computer scientist at the same time. And he says, well, we're essentially dealing with computer programs. So I like that he says, we're still talking about computers here, right? These are not some freaky new, entirely new things. These are computer programs, and they are designed to solve problems and to facilitate or aid decision making based on incomplete or uncertain information. And so for me, that's really the social function of AI: problem solving and decision making. And problem solving very, very often has a lot to do, not with complex problems necessarily, but with limited resources. So a lot of AI use in the social world has to do with organizations either not having money or not wanting to spend money on people or needing to making things more efficient. And so those are the problems. But you could also say the problems occur, for example, in research, in clinical research. AI is making huge or facilitating huge leaps in assessing if a drug should go to clinical trials, into a clinical trial or not. And so that's a different set of problems. And so just bear in mind, we're dealing here with problem solving and decision making, and we're coming back to that as we talk about recruiting. Now, there is a relationship between the word artificial intelligence and automated decision systems. And Lane also brought this up in preparation for this call. AI, as I said earlier, is something that invokes this sort of binary narrative of utopia or dystopia. It's, unclear, really deliberately so. But if we go back, to this and acknowledge the social function, then we can say, well, what AI is really doing is it is interfering in some way with decision making, and it is automating decision making, or it is automating part of the decision making. And so typically I like to talk about automated decision systems, or ADS, especially in my scientific papers or when I talk to policymakers. So I just wanted to explain the relationship between the two. However, for the sort of sake of this conversation, I'm going to stick with AI because it's a mouthful to say automated decision systems, but that is the proper way of talking about these systems. Now, a few other points that are important. One is AI is plural at this point of view. You will very rarely find yourself in a situation where you interact with just one system in any given situation. So even if if you use Gmail or Google Docs or Word, and you are typing and words are suggested, or they are suggested on your phone, that is one system, but it sits in a sort of ecosystem of more AI systems that interact with you. Another example for that is your social media feed, which also is an ecosystem of AIs that interact with each other to figure out what should be displayed in the feed, what ads should be recommended to you. So these systems interact with one another, but they also interact on the one hand with you as an individual, because they want to be as precise as possible with their prediction about you, as well as with the community, with everybody else, for example, on the social media platform, and the different subgroups on that platform. So AI is always a plural thing. AI also is a scaling technology. It is designed to do a lot of things at the same time, and it's always designed to save time and resources and increase productivity and efficiency. So it's a scaling technology. Why is that important? Because I sometimes get the question, well, why is bias in AI such a problem? Humans are biased too. Well, the thing is, human interaction is often one-on-one. If you think about your interaction, for example, with your doctor, that is a one-on-one relationship. But if that becomes an interaction between you and a system, then there are many yous, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. And if there is discrimination or bias at that intersection, then a lot of people are affected at once. And so that can, for example, happen when AI is used to detect or predict, I should say, fraudulent behavior. So there's an ongoing lawsuit in Michigan where a lot of people lost their benefits because they were wrongfully accused of fraudulent behavior based on an AI system. And so that wasn't just one sort of agent thinking that their client is engaging in fraudulent behavior. I think that the class is at least 10,000 people. And this is why it's a scaling technology. Now, AI is social infrastructure. It influences the breadth and depth of our associations. And it is, as I said earlier, very much involved in high stakes situations that can lead to these harms. So losing your benefits can be one, but also if you think about computer vision AI that is used to detect pedestrians that walk across a road, and there's an automated vehicle, and those computer vision systems are not as good as detecting darker skin tones, especially if it's a female presenting body, then you have inequity here, right? And a real harm in that there's an increased chance of one population getting hit by that vehicle and another not so much. And so recruiting is such a high stakes situation whereby AI prediction is really mediating access to the labor market. So who gets an interview, who gets a job? And almost all of that happens virtually these days. It was especially sort of accelerated during the pandemic. My research is focused on the top of what we call the hiring funnel, which you can see here, which is where recruiters find people and screen people. And so AI is used across all of these, but these are the two I want to sort of focus on. We do know that there is bias in recruiting because there's human bias, but we also know that there's bias in recruiting AI. There's been reporting on that for many years. Some of that goes back to sort of discriminatory effects of targeted advertising, so women not being shown certain job ads. We also have issues around personality tests that are driven by AI and that are used as a basis to make decisions who to interview. We have bias in recruiting, so all sorts of things. We also have heightened attention of regulators on recruiting AI. So we have a lot of regulators who want to come out and regulate artificial intelligence. The current administration is talking about that and has been talking about that. In the sort of a topical focus of AI regulation very often is employment and hiring. We have a bill in New York City that regulates that is already in effect. We have a bill in Illinois, so state level, which came into effect over 3 years ago, which regulates the use of video interviews in recruiting. We have the huge AI regulation in Europe that will be passed sometime this year that will have knock-on effects for the US. And we have sort of more individual agency-based interactions or projects, sort of soft regulatory approaches. For example, we had the EEOC who has warned against disability discrimination through the use of AI tools in recruiting in 2022. And we, of course, have the FTC who is also interested in understanding if the tools that are being advertised actually do what they say they do. Now, the case study, of course, is recruiting. Recruiting today is basically split in the middle between low volume recruiting and high volume recruiting. Low volume recruiting means that there are not a lot of people in the labor market who can do a certain job. That doesn't necessarily need to mean a quote unquote white collar job. That just, nurses, for example, are always sought after. That just means there's not a lot of talent around, and recruiters have to work extra hard to find these people and get them to talk to them. And then at the other end of the spectrum is high volume recruiting. Those are entry-level jobs, internships, warehouse jobs, a lot of service job, where there is sort of the opposite situation whereby people, like tons of people send their resumes and there are 10,000 jobs that, for example, Walmart has to fill for one role every year. And so AI is used for these two contexts in very different ways. In the low volume context, it's used to identify people and get them to talk to the recruiter and assess them. And in high volume, it's used to manage just the amount of applications that come in into organizations. And so at the high volume one, you have a lot of automated assessment where you may not even talk to a recruiter, where it's fully automated. I want to tell a story about low volume recruiting, whereby recruiters use, again, not just one AI, but many AIs. They have platform search, so your LinkedIn. They have video recruiting. You talk to into your camera, and then the transcript is analyzed by an AI. You have AI-driven search engines. You have AI-driven marketing tools. You have natural language processing tools that allow recruiters to write quote unquote more inclusive job ads. You have your personality assessment. All of these are used in conjunction with one another, right? AI is plural, many different systems that interact with one another. The most important thing that matters for recruiters in low volume recruiting is finding the right person, because they are in competition with everybody else to find, the talent. And they use Boolean searches. If you've ever had an introduction to a digital library system, you know what Boolean searches are. Boolean searches basically allow you to express a relationship between terms and then let the system find results that reflect that relationship. And they use that technique to search databases. They have for many years. It's an old information retrieval technique that recruiters are very used to. These are just some quotes from recruiters that I've spoken to. So when they find a good Boolean string, that's like finding gold for them. Boolean searches, as I said, work like this. You can use and, not, and or. You can say honey and badger means honey badger, but not badger means honey, and so on, right? So this is how recruiters think when they are looking for people in digital databases and digital platforms, and they have for many years. They think like a computer. These are real Boolean searches that recruiters have shared with me that they use on LinkedIn. So they are putting in, how they're trying to find people with the different software languages that they're looking for, the different job titles and skills. So this is like a language that they speak. Important is that Boolean is different from AI-driven search. No AI is needed for Boolean search. It's, again, a traditional information retrieval technique. And recruiters can't really use this for AI-driven search because an AI system will interpret your keywords for you. So when you say, oh, I'm looking for somebody who can bake bread, then the AI-driven search might say, well, you said bread, but what about pastry? We think you're also looking for people who do pastry. And that is a lift, an activity, and a predictive activity. The system is predicting what you're looking for, that very, very much clashes with the ways in which recruiters have developed a mindset of finding and searching people. And it is at that clash where there is mistrust that occurs because search results are different every single time. Recruiters can't go back and look, examine what keyword might have produced what result. So there's intransparency that occurs. And importantly, recruiters feel that their discretionary decision-making is affected by that because, like doctors or nurses or maybe teachers, there is a degree of discretionary decision-making that is really fundamental to that profession. That's why you do the job, right? You do the job as a recruiter because you're good at people. Why you become a doctor? Because you're good maybe at diagnostics, And so the system intervenes here as an automated decision system. And so there's something that happens here, and it's also about identity. And so we have an evolving relationship as semantic search and the improvement of natural language processing system becomes important, which is generative AI. So we have generative AI as the sort of new class of systems that are not just about that have at the heart still the identification of patterns, but then the sort of new thing about generative AI is that it is productive. It produces new content based on that prediction. That can be text, that can be computer code, that can be audio, or that can be images. And there is basically what happens here is that these AI models are making predictions that are based on data without a need for explicit programming. So it's a lot more accessible and easier. And so basically what a generative AI will do, it will just create similar patterns. If you ask a generative AI system that works image-based to create a cat, it will give you an image of a cat based on all the other cats it has seen and created. And so there are, of course, a lot of risks that are associated with that. We have the black box. We don't know how it works technically. Generative AI results can never be replicated. You will always get a different one. We also have legal black boxing. So these are protected by trade law. We have what we call hallucinations, which I'm sure you've heard about, which is the situation in which generative AI makes up facts because it's just really quite needy. It just wants to give you what you want or what it thinks it wants. We have a concentration of power, so very few companies who actually have these systems at hand and bake them into their tools. Microsoft, of course, one of them now with their stake in OpenAI. We have various harms. Generative AI systems can make up facts that, for example, can affect, if deployed in certain high-risk contexts, medical records. Of course, we have harms that can flow from generative AI that is used in political advertising, in the legal context. We have questions around, do these actually work well enough for people with different speech abilities, accents, languages? And we have a lack of regulation. But we also have a promise. We have increased accessibility with generative AI. I don't know if you've used ChatGPT, but it can help with things such as writing a thank you note for your birthday, or creating a summary on the bullet points that you have provided. It can make learning plans. It can help with imagination and opening up imagination. You can automate a lot of things. It can help with research and research administration. It can facilitate interaction, for example, with people with different learning abilities. You can, for example, ask it to create text in plain language. So there's a lot of good stuff that is happening as well, which kind of brings me full circled back to my sociology hat, which means as we all move forward with our sort of collective future with AI, especially generative AI, developing our own expertise around what these systems mean in our own social worlds is going to be more and more important as being literate about them in some way. And so I hope I have contributed to that a little bit, and I'm apologizing that I talked for a long time, and I'm very happy to delve into the discussion.
Thank you for that. That's a lot of information. I think we're all sort of sitting here, sort of synthesizing all of that sort of framing. I really appreciate the framing of AI or ADS, as you also use, as social infrastructure. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. We do have a few questions in the chat, and we'll see how many we can get to. And if folks have other questions that they want to ask, we have like 20 minutes left, so throw them into the chat and we'll see what we can get to. So this first is kind of actually a series of questions. It kind of boils down to the automation sort of idea of like, will AI produce automation that reduces. You talked about economic concerns as a category sort of impact, and this person is sort of asking, how this will affect the 1% versus how it will affect manual labor or white collar job. What might be automated. They're saying they're having a hard time thinking that no one would be working. And so is the idea like what would be our role also as consumers in that kind of economic system? So I know your talk isn't necessarily about the total impact of something like AI and AI systems on the economy at large, but if you might want to just sort of address that slightly here.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and such an important one. So in terms of the blue collar, white collar dichotomy vis-a-vis automation, I actually think that manual labor is not going away. I think that we will still need people who build buildings, for example, or roads, or engage in this very high skill work. People often say, oh, this is, manual labor is not high skill. I actually completely disagree. If you've ever seen, people harvesting Brussels sprouts, for example, like this is definitely so that I think won't hold anymore. I think we'll see sort of rapid automation in certain areas. So one area I can, for example, think of is going through and summarizing legal documents or documents related to law cases. So the paralegal work or first year attorney work. I think that will be automated, for example. There will be and there already is a very profession or activity specific use of generative AI, whether that is as a domestic laborer, you use it for meal planning, or you use it to summarize dense text for you, or to produce certain text for marketing purposes or recruiting purposes. So I think the blue and white collar distinction in terms of who's affected by this automation is not going to be the same. I will add, though, that what seems to be increasingly important is a certain proficiency of interacting with these systems. So, in the same way in which you are required to know how to, type, my mother always says, "Oh, you're so good at typing." And I said, well, it's my job. It used to be that you had to kind of take a class or go to school. Like now you just expected to be able to type. And so I think that is something that this prompt engineering, so interacting with generative AI systems or other types of AI systems, is something that will just be expected, much in the same way in which proficiency and project management software or the Microsoft Office suite is expected of people and my students. So I think that's something we will see, and we'll have to ramp up on that for sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm myself not proficient in this. Imagine other folks on this call maybe just beginning to dabble in that kind of proficiency. So it's interesting that might become an expectation, especially in the labor market. So there's another question here of, we're talking about HR recruitment sort of for professional jobs, but this is a different type of recruitment for college admissions processes. So Michael here is asking, do you know of colleges that are planning to use AI in that process? Can you envision a way that AI could be used in college recruitment or admissions?
Yeah, great question. So AI is, to my understanding, already being used in college admissions. I'm not entirely sure in what way, but I think in similar, in assessment to deal with large amounts of applicants. If you're interested in that, there is a really good outlet, and maybe those folks will want to come and talk to you, called The Markup. That's a media outlet that writes explicitly about tech and society issues, and they did some really good reporting of the use of AI systems in student interaction, not specific college admissions, but once students have entered college, their success, for example, can be predicted. And the markup, for example, found out that was racially biased, whereby students of color were more often recommended to change their major or drop out. So this has a lot to do with the allocation of resources to students. Now, ChatGPT college admissions essay. There's, of course, the question of our students using generative AI for that, or more broadly in the classroom. That is a very hot topic. We are still onto that. We're talking about that here at UVA. We have a task force and a report on that, but there's no silver bullet solution. I will say, though, that OpenAI used to have a generative AI detection tool whereby you could put in text and it would tell you how likely the text was to be generated by AI, to as a way to see if there was plagiarism. They have secretly switched that off there because it's not accurate enough, because the generative AI can't identify the generative AI. And there also is another platform that has been used for many years called Turnitin for detecting plagiarism. They had a similar detector. And NYU recently, I think just last week, decided that they were not going to allow for the use of that because it was inaccurate and affecting students who were wrongly accused of plagiarism. That's all to say, generative AI and colleges, hot topic, no general solutions in sight.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll continue to read about, college and AI in the news and for a while. But that kind of idea of those sort of detection tools leads right into this next question, which is, can you envision self-critical generative AI that catches itself plagiarizing or making things up?
That would be nice. I well, let's see. Not really, because you could, use a different system. You could use Google's Bard to assess if ChatGPT's output was fake or not. But again, think about the premise of generative AI. The cue really is in the word. It is all about generating something. That is what it's driving. That's what's the motivation, generating new content. And so that it doesn't have a brain. It can't distinguish what is real and what isn't. And so I think that's going to be really hard. And I think what's happening right now is we're all enrolled in this huge lab experiment that OpenAI has started with ChatGPT. And, whenever you interact with it, they collect data on it and they just see, how it's going. And we'll see. So
Yeah.
I'm not very optimistic.
And on that point about data collection, which again leads us right into the next question here is, and this is a question I'm interested in myself. It's so if all these systems, have mountains of data as their foundational piece, that's what AI is built upon. You had that like statistic cartoon, the AI is statistics framed. So if data is the foundation and much of that data are biased from the get-go, since it's based on, the past and how data was asked or collected or, things like that. How do we get past that? I guess sort of what are the effects of bias in data on AI systems because of their reliance on said data? And then like, what is the solution there?
Very, very important question. Thank you for asking that. So there is a general saying in sort of my field and beyond that says garbage in, garbage out. So if you have a biased data system, you will have a biased system. I think we can all agree on that. That seems obvious. You can mitigate those effects by creating a more balanced training set. In fact, a lot of regulation that we're going to see coming into effect makes a point of companies having to prove that they are working off more balanced data sets. If you have a data set, you also have sort of statistical techniques to work towards more fair outcomes. We can talk about the question whether purely technical approaches are going to get us to a good solution. But there is a little bit of an overemphasis on biased data sets that I kind of want to push back against, because what we also need to ask is, what is the system optimizing for? What is the whole idea that we're actually trying to materialize in the system? I'll give you an example. One of the tools that I critically examined with a couple of colleagues was automated personality assessment in hiring. That has been around for a long time, very popular. It sort of grew in tandem with corporate America. Personality assessment is not a scientific method. And there is the fundamental question if personality is actually a good predictor of job performance. And so that is a question that is outside of the AI that automates that we also need to ask. So you can have a very balanced training set for personality assessment AI, that doesn't allow you to ask the question, should we do that in the first place? And one, and two, should we automate that potentially problematic idea? Right. And so there was another sort of critical or a system that was used in recruiting, which was the analysis of micro expressions in your video interview. So how you would use your face as a sort of determining your personality. Of course, that is, you could say, well, that idea is a little bit, neogenesis, but also there is no scientific basis for that, and there are culturally distinct ways of facial expressions. There are different abilities in your facial muscles. So you know what I mean? So it's not just about the biased data set. It can also very much be about what are we trying to do and what is the context in which we deploy that, right? Should we be, deploying generative AI for transcription in the classroom system when there is a risk that words that were not spoken show up in a transcript, and those words can trigger punishment. If you are incarcerated and you have a conversation with your spouse, and any conversation, and you didn't talk about guns, but the word gun comes up in your transcript, and then you get consequences for that, and it goes into your record. Well, that is also outside of a biased data set. Does that make sense?
Yeah, these sort of upstream decision makings about the use itself of the technology, and whether that use is really the use that we need it to be, or is effective or predictive in the ways that we want it to be. So we only have 5 minutes left, but I wanted to ask, you mentioned some laws, the Illinois Interview Act, and some other ones, I think New York City, as well as the coming EU regulation. I'm just sort of summarize whether or not you think that regulation is going to be effective in addressing things like discrimination, in like the use of algorithms and AI in fields like hiring, and whether or not we're sort of seeing that regulation, coming. And I guess just sort of as the league, we're interested in our role in solving these problems. So sort of what civic organizations can do if regulation is a potential solution, how we might advocate for it. So it's a long-winded question, but if you could kind of just briefly address regulation of this problem.
Yes, I love to talk about regulation, and I'm glad that you asked that. So, yes, regulation helps. Always. Regulation is how we got, seatbelts, and how we, got food labels, and all sorts of things. So there is a good history of regulation helping us or protecting us from the harmful effects of products, and products in this case that we don't necessarily choose to buy ourselves, where we can make an informed decision as a consumer, but that we get enrolled in, sometimes without our knowledge. And so I think generally regulation is a good thing, and I commend all the regulators who are putting their hat together and working on this. I'm a little bit worried about the US, who are lagging behind in the global AI regulation game. We have the EU has worked on the EU AI Act for many years now. They're getting ready to pass it. It's been critiqued for being watered down, but it still has very concrete elements in it that are helpful, because it is based on a fairly clear risk framework. So the language of risk is central, and then the risk assessment is central. How risky is a certain system for the population? And it mandates also very concrete steps that companies have to take. They have to conduct a pre-market deployment assessment. So before they go to market, they have to demonstrate that they're testing for impact. And then there also has to be a post market assessment. So bias audits or audits of the system as it is in the market. So these are just very concrete and sort of fleshed out interventions that we're seeing in that large regulation, across the pond, which will have knock-on effects in the US. That's the good news, because the market in Europe is 500 million people, and companies who serve that market and serve the American market would do well, or probably will make adjustments and then just roll them out. We've seen that with the GDPR, data protection regulation. With regards to what you can do, I think creating a more literacy on the topic is extremely important. At this point, we all have lived experience on the topic in some way, shape, or form, because most of us have devices with these tools or interact with institutions who've deployed these tools. And making sure that our politicians and regulators also have literacy and are well-informed and are talking to a broad group of people when they are thinking about regulation. And that is, not just the professors, that are advocacy groups, that are people, for example, patient advocacy groups, or people who have experience with that, or professional associations who just have a profession-specific knowledge of what these tools mean for their work life. And so I think that is super, super important. A friend of mine compared this to the early days of the internet the other days, and I think that's fair. It's actually a fair comparison here, in that we kind of all have to work on this, and we have to make sure that this general purpose technology, which I think it is ultimately, works for everybody.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent answer to end on, and that pitch for us all to sort of encourage ourselves and our people within our organizations and others in the community to become literate on these issues, and also pressure our lawmakers or decision makers around these regulations to become literate themselves. I think the league fits right into into that role.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming and chatting with us. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording because we're at 6 o'clock now. But this was a wonderful discussion, and I know we didn't get to everything, and we'll certainly have more discussions on things like AI and algorithms. So I welcome everybody to keep an eye on our future topics and future guests. But thank you so much, Professor Sloane, for coming and chatting today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and keep doing the great work you're doing. So.